Julia had always believed in love. When she married Ethan Carter, she thought her life was complete. He was smart, hardworking, and kind, at least in the beginning. They built a life together, starting from nothing. Ethan wasn't always a billionaire. There was a time when they struggled, counting every dollar, dreaming of a better future. But Julia never complained. She believed in him, supported him, and worked hard by his side. As the years passed, Ethan's dreams became reality. His business took off, and suddenly they had everything: money, luxury, and a home that felt like a palace. Julia was happy, or at least she told herself she was. But something was changing. Ethan was no longer the same man she had married. At first, it was small things. He started coming home late, missing dinner. He stopped asking about her day. Their deep conversations turned into short, distracted exchanges. Julia tried to understand. Maybe he was just busy, stressed with work. Then the expensive gifts started arriving. At first, she thought they were sweet, a way for Ethan to make up for lost time. But soon, she realized something was wrong. The gifts were a distraction, not love. He was avoiding her, avoiding their marriage. One evening, Julia prepared his favorite dinner, hoping to bring back the warmth they once had. She lit candles, played soft music, and waited. Hours passed. The food went cold. When Ethan finally walked through the door, he looked different, distant, almost guilty. She asked, "Ethan, what's happening? You've changed." He didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he sighed and sat down, rubbing his temples. Then came the words that shattered her world. "Julia, I don't think I love you the same way anymore." Her heart stopped. "What are you saying?" "There's someone else," he admitted, barely above a whisper. Julia felt the ground disappear beneath her. The man she had loved, supported, and stood beside for years was now telling her he wanted someone new. A younger woman. Someone fresh, exciting. Someone who wasn't her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to break down in front of him. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice shaking. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "I'll make sure you're taken care of," he said, as if money could fix a broken heart. Julia didn't want his money. She wanted the man she had married, the love they had shared. But she could see it in his eyes. He had already moved on. That night, she packed her bags. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't fight for someone who had already chosen to leave. As she walked out of the mansion they once called home, she promised herself one thing: she would never let Ethan Carter break her again. She had no idea that fate had something even bigger in store for her. Julia spent the next few days in a blur of shock and sadness. The house that once felt like a safe haven now seemed empty, full of memories she wasn't sure she could keep. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. "There's someone else." She couldn't believe it. How had things changed so quickly? How had the man she had loved, the man who once promised to always be there, turned his back on her? She had hoped that maybe there had been some mistake. But when the lawyer's letter arrived a few days later, Julia knew the truth. Ethan wasn't coming back. He had filed for divorce, and it was final. No more talking. No more trying to fix things. The decision had been made, and it was over. Julia was left alone in a life she had built with Ethan, a life now slipping through her fingers. Her mind raced. What would she do? Where would she go? She had spent years being the supportive wife, focusing on Ethan's career, believing they were building a future together. Now she was staring at the wreckage of it all. Her family offered their support, but Julia didn't want to burden them with her pain. She had to handle this herself. She had always prided herself on being independent. And now, more than ever, she needed to prove it to herself. The divorce wasn't easy. Ethan was wealthy, and he made sure she got her fair share of the assets. But money couldn't fix the hole in her heart. No amount of luxury or expensive gifts could erase the betrayal she felt. In the quiet moments, Julia found herself questioning everything. Had she missed the signs? Had she been blind to the changes in Ethan? She remembered the late nights, the strange excuses, the way he seemed so distant. Looking back, it was clear. He had already fallen for someone else long before he ever said the words to her. But even as the pain of betrayal filled her, Julia knew she couldn't let it destroy her. She refused to let it define her. She had always been strong, and now was the time to prove it. The first step was moving out. Julia packed up her belongings, taking only what she truly needed. The house, once their home, felt like a prison. The memories of laughter, of love, seemed like they belonged to someone else. As she drove away, she felt the weight of her old life lifting off her shoulders. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. Julia found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far from the life she had once known. She worked hard to rebuild, focusing on herself and her future. She wasn't going to let Ethan's actions ruin her. She would take control of her life again. But even as she moved on, Julia couldn't help but think about the future. She knew things would be different now. She had made it through the worst, but what about the road ahead? Little did she know, life was about to throw her another curveball, one she never saw coming. Julia's life after the divorce wasn't easy, but she was determined to make it work. She focused on getting back on her feet, one small step at a time. Moving into her new apartment was a fresh start. It wasn't luxurious like the mansion she had shared with Ethan, but it was hers. She decorated it with things that brought her comfort: soft blankets, cozy chairs, and photos of her family. It was a humble home, but it felt like a place she could finally breathe. She spent her days working long hours. Julia had always been good with numbers, so she started doing accounting work for small businesses around the city. It wasn't the glamorous life she had imagined when she was married to Ethan, but it was fulfilling. She knew that if she wanted to move forward, she had to build something of her own. But as much as Julia threw herself into her work, there were still quiet moments when the weight of loneliness crept in. She missed the life she had once shared with Ethan, even though he had hurt her. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what went wrong. But deep down, she knew that dwelling on the past wouldn't help her heal. She couldn't change what had happened. The only thing she could control was what came next. A few months after the divorce, Julia received news that shook her to the core. She was pregnant. It wasn't something she had planned for, but it was real. At first, she was terrified. How could she raise a child on her own? What kind of future could she offer a baby when she was just starting over? But as soon as she saw the positive test result, something inside her clicked. She wasn't alone anymore. This baby, this little life growing inside her, would be her future. Julia knew she had to do everything she could to make sure her child had a happy, safe life. No matter what it took, she would be a good mother. The next few months were a blur. Julia took care of herself and worked hard to prepare for the baby's arrival. She found a small support group of single mothers who helped her feel less alone. They shared their struggles and triumphs, offering advice and comfort. Julia learned a lot from them about being a parent, and it gave her the strength to face the challenges ahead. When the time finally came, Julia gave birth to quadruplets, 2 boys and 2 girls. She was overwhelmed with emotion as she held them for the first time. They were perfect. They were hers. Raising 4 children on her own wasn't easy, but Julia found joy in every small moment. She was exhausted, but she never complained. Her love for her children made every challenge worthwhile. The days were long, and the nights were sleepless, but Julia was determined. She didn't need Ethan. She had her children, and that was more than enough. But even with her new life, Julia couldn't shake the thought of Ethan. What would he think when he found out about the children? Would he even care? She pushed those thoughts aside. She had come too far to look back now. Life had changed for Julia in ways she couldn't have imagined, and the future was still uncertain. But one thing was clear: she was strong enough to face whatever came her way. As the months went by, Julia settled into her new life as a single mother. Her 4 children, Alex, Emma, Noah, and Lily, became the center of her world. Each day was filled with laughter, tears, and the challenges that come with raising quadruplets. The house was always noisy, with the constant sound of little feet running and voices calling for her attention. Yet, amidst the chaos, Julia found a deep sense of fulfillment. She had always been independent, but nothing had tested her strength quite like motherhood. The days blurred together, filled with feeding, diaper changes, and trying to juggle work with the never-ending needs of her children. Despite the exhaustion, Julia never once complained. She loved them more than anything, and she wanted them to have the best life she could give them. Every evening, after the kids were tucked into bed, Julia would sit down with a cup of tea and think about how far she had come. She had lost so much, her marriage, her old life, but in return, she had gained something even more precious. Her children brought her joy in ways she never thought possible. They were her everything. But there were still moments when doubt crept into her mind. Was she doing enough for them? Was she strong enough to give them everything they needed? Julia had no family close by, no one to help with the children. She had to do it all herself. There were days when she felt overwhelmed, like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. But then her children would smile, or laugh, or hold her hand, and everything else seemed to fade away. They were her motivation to keep going. Julia's small business also began to grow. What had started as a side hustle, helping local businesses with their bookkeeping, had turned into a successful venture. She was proud of how far she had come, knowing that every achievement was something she had built on her own. It wasn't easy, but she had learned to balance the demands of motherhood with her career. And slowly, things were starting to improve. Yet, as successful as Julia was becoming, there was still an empty space in her heart. She had never stopped thinking about Ethan. The pain from their divorce had faded over time, but the unanswered questions remained. What was he doing now? Did he ever think about her and the children? Julia had no answers, but she tried not to dwell on it. Her focus was on the future, on her children, and on making sure they had everything they needed. One evening, as Julia was finishing up some work after the kids went to bed, the doorbell rang. She opened the door, surprised to see a package addressed to her. It was from Ethan. She had not heard from him in over a year, and the sight of his name on the package brought a wave of emotions rushing back. Hesitant, but curious, she opened it. Inside was a letter and a small gift. The letter was brief, but the words caught her off guard. "I hope this reaches you well. I've thought a lot about the past and wanted to offer something for you and the kids. Please take this as a small gesture." Julia stared at the letter, her heart racing. She hadn't expected this. After everything, why was Ethan reaching out now? Ethan had everything he had ever wanted. His company had grown beyond his wildest dreams, and he had all the wealth and luxury anyone could ask for. But as the months turned into years, he began to feel an emptiness that money couldn't fill. The new life he had built, the fresh start with a younger woman, none of it felt as fulfilling as he had hoped. At first, Ethan told himself he was just going through a rough patch. After all, he had always been driven by success, and now he had it all. But the thrill of new beginnings soon faded, and the mistakes of the past started to catch up with him. The relationship with his new partner fell apart quicker than he had expected. She, too, seemed to have been interested in his wealth more than his heart, and once the shine of his riches wore off, so did their bond. Ethan had never truly realized how much he missed Julia until it was too late. Their marriage, for all its flaws, had been real. They had shared years of love, laughter, and dreams together, even if they had lost sight of it toward the end. He had betrayed her, broken their trust, and now the guilt weighed heavily on his heart. His business, once thriving, also faced difficulties. The decisions he had made while distracted by his personal life began to show. Investors grew wary of his leadership, and his company's reputation took a hit. What had once seemed like an unstoppable empire now felt fragile and uncertain. Ethan tried to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. He told himself that he would turn things around, that he could rebuild everything just like he had done in the past. But as the months dragged on, it became clear that things weren't improving. The money, the fame, the luxury, none of it brought him happiness. He was alone, and the one person who could have helped him through this was no longer a part of his life. Julia, the woman he had once taken for granted, was now living a life he could never have imagined for her. She had found strength, resilience, and a purpose that didn't rely on him. She had moved on, built a life for herself and her children. And Ethan, despite all his wealth, was left with nothing but the emptiness of regret. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he also knew that he had to try. He had to make things right, if only to find peace within himself. He thought about reaching out to Julia, but he hesitated. Would she even want to hear from him? Could he ever undo the damage he had caused? The fear of rejection held him back. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had no choice. He had to try. If he wanted redemption, he had to start somewhere. And the only person who might understand what he was going through was the woman he had once loved. Ethan wasn't sure what would come of it, but he knew he had to make the first move. And so, one evening, he sat down and wrote a letter. A simple letter, full of honesty and regret. He had no idea how Julia would respond, but it was a step forward, a step toward healing. Months passed since Ethan sent that letter to Julia. He didn't hear anything back, and though he had hoped for a response, part of him feared that she had truly moved on. Julia had every right to turn him away, and part of him understood why. After everything that had happened, he didn't expect forgiveness, but he did hope for some kind of answer. Life continued for Ethan, but it felt empty. His company was still struggling, his relationships were broken, and the regret he felt was constant. He would sometimes catch himself wondering what Julia and the children were doing, but he quickly pushed the thoughts away. He had no right to know, no right to be curious after everything he had done. One rainy afternoon, while attending a charity gala, Ethan stood near the entrance of the grand hall, his thoughts distant as he watched the crowd mingle. He was lost in a sea of voices, his mind preoccupied with everything that had gone wrong in his life. He barely noticed when a woman walked past him, her bright smile catching his eye. At first, he thought it was just another guest, but something about her made him pause. There was a familiar warmth in her presence that he couldn't ignore. Ethan's heart skipped a beat when he looked more closely. It was Julia, standing there, looking just as beautiful and confident as the day he had lost her. She was no longer the woman who had stood by him through all the hard times. The time apart had changed her. She had grown stronger, more self-assured. She didn't look like the woman who had begged for his love. She looked like someone who had found peace on her own. For a moment, he stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should he walk up to her? Should he say something? Ethan knew that Julia had every reason to hate him, but the pull of seeing her again was stronger than his fear. He took a step forward, and his voice caught in his throat when their eyes met. "Julia," he said softly, his voice full of hesitation. Her expression softened, but there was a certain distance in her gaze. She didn't look angry, but she didn't look happy either. "Ethan," she replied, her tone polite but distant. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I sent you a letter, but I never heard back." Julia nodded slowly. "I received it," she said, her words guarded, "but I needed time. I didn't know what to say to you." Ethan nodded, understanding. He had hoped for a different reaction, but he knew it was impossible to rush healing. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "For everything. I was wrong to leave you the way I did." Julia studied him for a moment before speaking. "I'm not the same person I was when you left, Ethan. And neither are you. But we can't go back to what was. I've built a life for myself and my children. I'm happy now." Ethan swallowed hard. "I'm glad to hear that. I really am. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything I did. I didn't know what I had until I lost it." Julia didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Maybe that's true," she said finally. "But sometimes, the past is better left there. We can't change it. And we shouldn't try to." Ethan felt a pang of regret, but also a sense of clarity. He knew Julia was right. He couldn't change the past. He could only move forward. Before Julia could say anything else, one of her children ran up to her. Ethan's heart skipped as he saw the child's face. So familiar. It was Alex, one of the quadruplets. "Mom, I'm hungry," Alex said, his voice full of energy. Julia smiled, her eyes softening as she looked down at him. "All right, sweetie. Let's go get something to eat." She turned to Ethan. "It was good to see you again, Ethan. Take care of yourself." And with that, she walked away. Alex and Tao, leaving Ethan standing there with more questions than answers. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had seen a glimpse of the woman he had once loved. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally moving on. After the charity gala, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Julia. The way she had looked at him, polite, but distant, stayed with him for days. She had built a life without him, a life full of love and purpose, and he had no right to ask for a place in it. But despite the distance between them, he couldn't ignore the aching feeling in his chest. He had made so many mistakes, and no matter how hard he tried, it felt like he could never fix what had been broken. He was left with nothing but regrets. The next few weeks went by slowly for Ethan. He still hadn't heard from Julia, but he couldn't bring himself to contact her again. He knew she had made it clear that the past was behind her. He respected that, but it didn't make the pain go away. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, staring out at the city lights, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it made his heart skip a beat. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, Ethan." The voice on the other end was calm, but familiar. It was Julia. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but he felt a rush of hope. "Julia, is everything okay?" "I need to talk to you," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her tone that made Ethan's stomach twist. "Of course. What's going on?" "I think you should know something," she said slowly. "I didn't just move on after you left. I had a life of my own to rebuild, yes. But I also had something else, something I never expected." Ethan felt a sharp pang of fear. What could she mean? Was it about the children? Did she have more to say about their past? "Julia, what are you saying?" he asked, his voice trembling with concern. "I'm not just raising the quadruplets on my own, Ethan. There's something you need to know." She paused, then added, "You have children, Ethan. Not just the ones you know about. There's more." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. His mind raced as he tried to process what Julia was saying. More children? How was that even possible? He had never heard anything about it. I don't understand." "How?" Ethan stammered, still struggling to wrap his mind around it. Julia took a deep breath before continuing. "The quadruplets you know about. Alex, Emma, Noah, and Lily. They're yours, Ethan. But I never told you about them until now. You have a family, and I wanted you to know." For a long moment, Ethan couldn't speak. His mind was in a whirl. He had children. Real, living children who had grown up without him. They were his flesh and blood, and yet he had no idea they existed until now. The guilt that surged within him was unbearable. He had been absent from their lives, not because he didn't care, but because he had never known. Julia's voice broke through his thoughts. "I never wanted to hurt you, Ethan. I never wanted you to miss out on this. But you weren't there when I needed you, and I couldn't keep you in the dark forever. I just wanted you to know the truth." Ethan finally found his voice. "Julia, I don't know what to say. I'm sorry. I should have been there for you. I should have been there for all of you." "I know, Ethan," she replied softly. "But now you know. The past can't be changed, and neither can the mistakes we've made. But there's something I need you to understand. What? The children. They don't know you, and they might not want to. They've had a life without you, and I'm not sure if they're ready to meet you. But if you truly want to be part of their lives, it's going to take time. A lot of time. Ethan swallowed hard. He didn't expect things to be easy, but hearing Julia's words made the situation feel even more complicated. He had a family now, a family that he had abandoned without even knowing it. I understand, he said quietly. I'm ready to do whatever it takes. As the conversation ended, Ethan sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. He had always dreamed of a family, but never had he imagined it like this. The truth had hit him harder than he could have ever expected. He had so much to make up for, and so much more to learn. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Julia. He had children, his children, whom he had never known. 4 beautiful kids, all growing up without him. And now he had to find a way to become a part of their lives. It wasn't going to be easy, he knew that, but he was determined to try. The next few days were filled with uncertainty. Ethan spent hours wondering how he could reach out to the children. What would they think of him? Would they even want to meet their father? The fear of rejection made his chest tighten every time he thought about it. Julia had made it clear that it would take time, and he respected that. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he wasn't just fighting for his place in their lives. He was also fighting for the chance to make things right. He had so many regrets, but he was ready to face them. He wrote a letter to Julia, apologizing once again and telling her how much he wanted to be there for the kids. He didn't expect an immediate response, but he needed her to know that he was willing to do whatever it took. Days passed without hearing anything back, and Ethan tried not to let the silence overwhelm him. He knew Julia had a life to manage, especially with the quadruplets. He tried to distract himself with work, but it wasn't the same. Every moment he thought about them, his children. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his chest that told him he had to keep trying. Then, one evening, after a long day at the office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Julia. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it. "I've thought about your letter," it began. "I spoke with the children, and they're curious. But they're also cautious. I'm not sure how they'll react, but we'll take things slow. If you're really serious about this, we'll try. But don't expect miracles." Ethan's eyes filled with tears as he read the message. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope. Julia wasn't rejecting him. She was giving him a chance. A small chance, yes, but it was enough for him to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild what had been lost. He quickly typed a reply, thanking her for the opportunity. He promised her that he would respect her boundaries and take things one step at a time. He didn't want to rush anything. The last thing he wanted was to push them away. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Ethan began visiting Julia's house more often. Each time, the children were there, and each time, the distance between them seemed to grow smaller. At first, the kids were shy, unsure of who this man was who claimed to be their father. They had heard about him, but they had never seen him. Ethan didn't rush them. He simply spent time with them, getting to know their likes and dislikes, their personalities and their dreams. Julia watched from the sidelines, cautious but hopeful. She had been the only parent for so long, and she was protective of her children. She wanted to believe that Ethan could change, but she wasn't sure if it was too late. As the days went on, the children began to warm up to him. Slowly, they started calling him Dad. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments of doubt, but Ethan was patient. He had waited so long to be a part of their lives. He knew that rebuilding their trust would take time. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Ethan realized that he was finally starting to feel whole again. He had a family, a real family. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and for the first time in a long while, he believed that redemption was possible. It wasn't going to be easy, and he would face challenges along the way, but the chance to make things right was worth fighting for.